In 1975, a 24-year-old engineer at Kodak named Steven Sasson built something extraordinary in the company's lab. It was the size of a toaster, weighed 8 pounds, and took black and white images at zero point zero 0.01 megapixels. The resolution was terrible. The images took 23 seconds to appear on a television screen. By every measure, it was crude, clunky, and impractical. However, it was also the world's first digital camera. And Kodak, the company that dominated photography for a century, had just invented the technology that would eventually kill it. Steven Sasson showed his prototype to Kodak's executives. He demonstrated how it worked, explained the technology, and outlined where it could go in the future. The executives watched. They asked questions. They saw the potential. And then they made a decision that would define corporate failure for generations to come. They told Sasson to keep working on it, but quietly. Don't tell anyone outside the company. Don't. File patents that would draw attention. And whatever you do, don't let this technology threaten our film business. That decision, made in a conference room in Rochester, New York, started a chain reaction that would take 37 years to fully play out. By the time it ended, Kodak would file for bankruptcy, lay off 145,000 employees, and watch its stock price collapse from a high of $94 per share to just 37 cents. The company that once held a 90% market share in film and an 85% share in cameras would become a case study in how to destroy yourself from the inside. This is the story of how Kodak invented the future, then spent decades pretending it didn't exist. It's about a company so dominant that it couldn't imagine a world without film. It's about executives who chose short-term profits over long-term survival, and it's about what happens when you're so successful that you become your own worst enemy. Before we dive deeper into this story, if you're finding this interesting, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more content like this, and it lets us know you want to see the full picture of how great companies fall. Now, let's get into how Kodak built its empire in the first place. To understand Kodak's downfall, you need to see how dominant it once was. In 1976, Kodak ranked among the world's most valuable brands, alongside Coca-Cola and IBM. Photography itself was synonymous with Kodak. Founded in 1888 by George Eastman, the company's mission was simple: make photography accessible to everyone. His Kodak #1 camera came preloaded with film for 100 shots. Users mailed the camera back, and Kodak handled development, printing, and reloading. The slogan said it all: "You press the button, we do the rest." This innovation democratized photography and created a brilliant business model. Kodak didn't just sell cameras, it sold film, paper, and services. Every photo meant recurring revenue. The razor and blades approach, cheap hardware, profitable consumables, delivered extraordinary margins, sometimes 70% or more. By the 1960s, Kodak controlled 90% of US film sales and 85% of camera sales. Competitors existed, but Kodak was the market. Its influence extended beyond business. Kodak moments became part of everyday language, tied to birthdays, weddings, vacations, and family milestones. In Rochester, New York, Kodak employed 75,000 people, nearly one-third of the city's population. The company funded schools, hospitals, and arts programs, and its prosperity fueled the city's growth. Working at Kodak meant stability, identity, and community. But Kodak's empire was built entirely around film. Factories, supply chains, research labs, and retail partnerships all revolved around it. This made Kodak efficient but inflexible, like a supertanker. Powerful but hard to turn. When Steven Sasson presented his digital camera prototype in 1975, executives immediately saw the threat. Digital photography eliminated film, development, and printing, the pillars of Kodak's profits. Yet they chose to protect the core business, treating digital as a distant issue. That cautious approach proved disastrous. The rise of personal computers, the internet, and new competitors with no film legacy accelerated the shift. Kodak had built an empire, but empires, even the strongest, cannot last forever. And the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Chapter 3: The Long Denial. After Steven Sasson's 1975 prototype, Kodak didn't ignore digital photography. The company invested heavily, filing over 1,000 patents by the early 2000s and spending hundreds of millions on research. Its engineers understood the technology and foresaw its trajectory. But knowing and acting are different things. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Kodak's strategy was to delay digital adoption. Film delivered margins of up to 70%, while early digital cameras promised far less. Protecting the lucrative core business seemed rational, even brilliant on paper. Yet markets don't wait for spreadsheets. Competitors in Japan, Sony, Canon, Nikon, Fujifilm, saw digital as opportunity, not threat, and moved faster. Inside Kodak, debates raged. Engineers warned that Moore's Law would drive sensor costs down and quality up. They saw digital's inevitability. But executives, marketers, and factory managers were tied to film. Billions in revenue, millions of rolls produced daily, and a century of identity built on chemistry and paper. Their guiding question was always, how do we do this without killing film sales? Kodak did release digital products, like the 1991 DCS-100, a $13,000 modified Nikon aimed at professionals. It sold modestly to newspapers and studios, but didn't spark a consumer revolution. Executives took this as proof that digital wasn't ready. Meanwhile, rivals kept advancing. The truth is, Kodak didn't fail because it ignored innovation. It failed because it innovated defensively. Its labs produced groundbreaking patents, but every digital effort was constrained by the need to protect film. Competitors asked a different question. How do we make the best digital camera possible? That difference in mindset proved decisive. If your goal is to avoid killing film sales, you make digital cameras expensive so they don't cannibalize the film market. You limit production so supply stays tight. You don't invest heavily in marketing because you don't want to create demand too quickly. You position digital as a premium option for professionals, not a replacement for film. All of Kodak's digital camera strategies in the 90s followed this playbook. Make good cameras, but not too good. Sell them, but not too aggressively. Innovate, but not in ways that accelerate film's decline. If your goal is to make the best digital camera possible, you do everything different. You invest in bringing costs down as fast as possible because lower prices mean more customers. You improve image quality aggressively because better cameras create more demand. You market heavily to build brand awareness and drive adoption. You price to gain market share, even if that means lower margins in the short term. Companies like Canon and Sony, which had less to lose from film's decline, could pursue this strategy. Kodak couldn't, or at least believed it couldn't. By the late 90s, the market was starting to shift in ways that Kodak could no longer ignore. Digital cameras were getting cheaper. In 1996, Casio launched the QV10 for $800. In 1999, Nikon released the Coolpix 990 for $900. These weren't professional cameras. They were aimed at regular consumers. Resolution was improving too. Cameras that offered 2 or 3 megapixels were becoming common, and while that wasn't as good as film, it was good enough for most people's needs, especially when balanced against the advantages of digital. Those advantages were obvious, and they appealed to a generation that was already comfortable with computers. No film to buy meant immediate cost savings. No developing costs meant more savings. Instant preview of images meant you could see if you got the shot before leaving the scene. The ability to delete bad shots and retake them meant less waste and more keeper images. You could transfer images to a computer and share them via email. These benefits weren't subtle. They were clear, practical, and valuable, especially to younger consumers who had grown up with computers and saw digital technology as normal, not threatening. Kodak could see it happening. The company's own market research showed the trend lines. Sales of digital cameras were growing at double-digit rates year over year. Film sales were still growing too, but the growth was slowing. The company had demographics showing that younger consumers, people under 35, were more interested in digital cameras than their parents were. All the data pointed to an inevitable transition. However, seeing a trend and acting on it are different things, especially when acting means dismantling the machine that made you successful in the first place. In 2001, Kodak made a decision that would define its next decade. The company announced it would invest heavily in digital photography, but it would also maintain its film business for as long as the market supported it. Kodak believed it could manage both transitions simultaneously, make money from film as long as it lasted, then pivot to digital when necessary. Use the profits from film to fund the transition to digital. This wasn't a terrible strategy on paper. In fact, it's what business schools teach. Don't abandon your core business until you have to. Milk it for cash while you build new capabilities. Manage the transition carefully to minimize disruption. However, this strategy required 3 things that Kodak didn't have. First, it required perfect timing. You had to know exactly when to shift resources from film to digital. Shift too early and you leave money on the table from film sales. Shift too late and you've missed the digital market. Second, it required flawless execution. You had to run two completely different businesses with different economics, different customers, and different distribution channels without letting either one suffer. Third, it required a market that moved slowly enough to accommodate both businesses. You needed time to make the transition without losing market share to competitors who were fully committed to one direction or the other. Kodak got none of those things. The timing was impossible to perfect because markets don't move in predictable ways. The execution was difficult because running two businesses meant satisfying neither the needs of digital customers nor the needs of film. Customers. And the market moved faster than anyone predicted, accelerated by a competitor that Kodak never saw coming. If you're finding this interesting, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more content like this, and it lets us know you want to see the full picture of how great companies fall. Now, let's get into how Kodak built its empire in the first place. In 2005, something happened that changed photography forever, but it had nothing to do with cameras. On February 14th, 3 former PayPal employees launched a website called YouTube. Suddenly, sharing moments wasn't just about printing photos anymore. It was about uploading videos and sharing them with the world. Then, in 2007, Apple released the iPhone. Steve Jobs stood on stage and introduced a device that was a phone, an iPod, and an internet communicator. He barely mentioned the camera. However, that camera changed everything. The iPhone's first camera was terrible by technical standards. It had 2 megapixels, no flash, and no video capability. Professional photographers laughed at it. Kodak's engineers dismissed it. However, the iPhone had something more important than image quality. It had convenience and connectivity. You could take a photo and share it instantly. No downloading images to a computer, no cables or memory cards, just point, shoot, and send. That combination of camera plus internet was more powerful than anyone at Kodak realized. Within a few years, smartphone cameras improved dramatically. By 2010, the iPhone 4 had a 5 megapixel camera with an LED flash and HD video recording. It was good enough for most people's needs. Why carry a separate camera when your phone could do the job? The answer, for millions of consumers, was that you didn't need to. Sales of point-and-shoot cameras began to collapse. In 2010, the industry sold 21 million digital cameras. By 2015, that number had fallen to 35 million. The smartphone had killed the camera market. Kodak never stood a chance in this new world. The company had no expertise in smartphones. It had no software platform. It couldn't compete with Apple, Samsung, or Google. Kodak's business had always been about hardware, about making physical products that captured and displayed images. However, the new photography wasn't about hardware. It was about software, networks, and ecosystems. Instagram launched in 2010 and reached 1 million users in 2 months. These users weren't buying cameras or film. They were using phones they already owned to take photos, apply filters, and share them instantly. Kodak had nothing to offer in this world. The company tried to adapt. In 2012, Kodak launched its own smartphone, the Kodak IM5. It was a desperate attempt to enter the market that was destroying its business. The phone had a 13 megapixel camera and ran Android. Reviews were mediocre, sales were worse. The phone disappeared from the market within a year. Kodak also tried to create its own photo sharing platform, Kodak Gallery, but it couldn't compete with Facebook, Instagram, and Flickr. These platforms had network effects. The more users they had, the more valuable they became. Kodak entered too late with too little, and nobody noticed. Meanwhile, Kodak's traditional businesses were imploding. Film sales were in freefall. In 2000, Kodak's film division generated over $14 billion in revenue. By 2011, that number had dropped below $6 billion. The decline wasn't gradual anymore. It was a cliff. People weren't just buying less film, they were stopping entirely. Digital had won. Smartphones had accelerated the transition beyond what anyone predicted, and Kodak, despite inventing digital photography, had almost no position in the new market. The company tried to cut costs. Between 2000 and 2007, Kodak laid off 47,000 employees. Factory after factory closed. The company sold buildings, equipment, and even some of its patent portfolio to raise cash. Rochester, which had depended on Kodak for over a century, watched as its largest employer shrank year after year. The city's economy suffered. Unemployment rose. Entire neighborhoods declined as former Kodak workers left to find jobs elsewhere. The social cost of Kodak's collapse was devastating. In 2011, Kodak's stock price fell below $1 per share. The company had once been worth over $30 billion at its peak in 1997. By late 2011, its market cap had shrunk to $220 million. Kodak had lost 99% of its value in 14 years. The company was burning through cash, trying to stay afloat. It had over $6 billion in debt. Revenue was declining by double digits every year, and there was no plan that would change the trajectory. On January 19th, 2012, Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The announcement shocked no one who had been paying attention, but it still felt surreal. Kodak, the company that taught the world how to take pictures, was bankrupt. The company that coined the term Kodak moment was out of money. 131 years of history had led to this. Not because Kodak failed to innovate, not because the company didn't see the future coming, but because when the future arrived, Kodak couldn't let go of the past. Let's take stock of what just happened. Between 2005 and 2012, Kodak went from a struggling but viable company to complete bankruptcy. The smartphone revolution destroyed the camera market. Instagram and social media made photo sharing instant and free. Kodak tried to compete but had no expertise in software, networks, or mobile platforms. The company laid off tens of thousands of workers, closed factories, and sold assets, but nothing could stop the bleeding. Film was dead, digital cameras were dying, and Kodak had no place in the new world of smartphone photography. However, the story doesn't end with bankruptcy. What happened next was almost as important as the fall itself. Kodak survived, but as something completely different from what it had been. Kodak emerged from bankruptcy in September 2013, but the company that came out bore little resemblance to the one that went in. The new Kodak had 7,000 employees, down from 145,000 at its peak. It had exited the consumer photography business entirely. No more cameras, no more film for consumers. The company now focused on commercial printing, packaging, and business-to-business services. Kodak still existed, but only as a shadow of its former self. The brand that once defined photography was now a footnote in an industry it created. The bankruptcy did accomplish one important thing. It forced Kodak to sell most of its patent portfolio to pay creditors. Companies like Apple, Google, Samsung, and others bought licenses to Kodak's digital imaging patents. The irony was brutal. Kodak had invented many of the technologies these companies used in their smartphones and digital cameras. The company held patents covering image compression, digital image processing, and camera hardware. However, Kodak couldn't turn those patents into products people wanted to buy. Other companies took the technology Kodak created and built billion-dollar businesses around it, while Kodak collapsed. Today, Kodak still exists, but it's irrelevant to most consumers. The company makes money from commercial printing equipment and packaging materials. It has some specialty divisions that produce motion picture film for Hollywood, serving a niche market of directors who prefer shooting on film. In 2022, Kodak's annual revenue was around $1.2 billion. For comparison, Apple's revenue that same year was $394 billion. Much of that came from iPhones, with cameras that do what Kodak's digital camera prototypes did in the 1970s, just infinitely better. So what lessons can we take from Kodak's collapse? The first is that past success doesn't guarantee future survival. Kodak dominated photography for over a century. It had the resources, the talent, and the technology to succeed in the digital age. However, the company's success with film became a liability. Kodak couldn't imagine a world without film because film had always been the source of its power and profits. That inability to imagine a different future led to paralysis when the future arrived anyway. The second lesson is about the innovator's dilemma. Clayton Christensen wrote about this in his famous book, and Kodak is the textbook example. When a new technology threatens your core business, you face an impossible choice. Embrace the new technology and destroy your existing revenue streams, or protect your existing business and let competitors take the new market. Kodak tried to do both and ended up doing neither well. The company couldn't commit fully to digital because it was too afraid of killing film. Meanwhile, competitors who had no film business to protect could move aggressively into digital without looking back. The third lesson is about timing. Kodak had the technology first. The company filed patents on digital imaging technologies throughout the 1980s and 90s. However, having the technology early doesn't matter if you don't commercialize it effectively. Kodak waited too long to make digital cameras mainstream because it was trying to protect film margins. By the time the company fully committed to digital, Sony, Canon, Nikon, and others had established positions. Then, smartphones arrived and disrupted the entire market before Kodak could catch up. Being first means nothing if you don't act on it. The fourth lesson is organizational. Large companies struggle to disrupt themselves because their entire structure is optimized for the existing business model. Kodak's factories made film. Its supply chains distributed film. Its sales force sold film. Its retail partnerships displayed film. Changing all of that required dismantling the machine that made Kodak successful. It required laying off people, closing factories, and alienating partners. That's incredibly hard to do, especially when the existing business is still profitable. Companies naturally resist self-disruption because it's painful and uncertain. However, if you don't disrupt yourself, someone else will do it for you, and they'll be much more ruthless about it. The fifth lesson is about culture. Kodak's culture was built around film. The company's identity, pride, and sense of purpose came from making products that captured memories on film. Asking Kodak to abandon film was like asking the company to abandon its identity. That's why so many decisions seem irrational in hindsight. Executives weren't stupid. They were trapped by a culture that couldn't let go of what made it great. Changing culture is harder than changing strategy, and Kodak never managed to do it in time. The sixth and perhaps most important lesson is about denial. Kodak saw digital photography coming. The company knew film would eventually decline. However, knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are different. Kodak kept pushing the threat into the future. Digital isn't good enough yet. Consumers still prefer film. We have more time. These statements were true for a while, but they became excuses for inaction. By the time Kodak accepted that digital was inevitable, the window to lead the transition had closed. Other companies had already captured the market. Kodak's story is a warning to every successful company. Market dominance is temporary. Technology changes. Consumer preferences shift. And if you're not willing to disrupt your own business, someone else will. The companies that survive aren't necessarily the ones that invent the future. They're the ones that embrace it, even when it means destroying what made them successful in the first place. Kodak invented digital photography and then spent 37 years trying to pretend it didn't matter. That decision cost the company everything. There's a final bitter irony to Kodak's story. In 2023, Kodak was still trading on the stock market under the ticker symbol KODK. Its share price fluctuated between $3 and $6. The company survived bankruptcy, but it will never return to what it was. Meanwhile, the smartphone cameras that killed Kodak are now so advanced that they rival professional equipment. People take trillions of photos every year on devices that fit in their pockets. Photography is more accessible and popular than George Eastman ever imagined when he founded Kodak in 1888. However, the company that made that vision possible is gone, replaced by tech giants that didn't exist when Kodak was at its peak. The Kodak moment still exists. We still capture birthdays, graduations, weddings, and vacations. We still preserve the memories that matter. We just don't need Kodak to do it anymore. That's the real tragedy. Kodak didn't fail because it made bad products. It failed because it couldn't let go of great ones. The company invented the future, looked at it, understood what it meant, and then chose to bet on the past anyway. And in the end, the past couldn't save it. If this deep dive into one of the most spectacular corporate failures in history was valuable to you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue making in-depth content like this, and it lets us know you want to see more analysis of how great companies fall and what we can learn from their mistakes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.